Alright guys, we are up to part 2 of Victory in Europe, the final half of the story. And today we're going to look at, the first thing we're going to look at is the Battle of D-Day. And this is an incredibly important moment in World War II history. And it's a great example of what we call an amphibious assault. An amphibious assault, and we'll look at this a lot more in the Pacific War. This is where soldiers are stationed on ships, and then they have to go from the ships to the shore and attack that beach that is being defended by the enemy. It's a very difficult maneuver to pull off successfully because you are sitting ducks out here in the water for sure. D-Day, again, a great example of an amphibious assault. So let's get some background, guys. By the spring of 1944, about 3 million Allied soldiers have gathered in England awaiting the invasion of France. And our general in charge of this whole adventure is going to be General Dwight D. Eisenhower. We looked at him in our last video. Again, future President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, he's given command because the majority of those 3 million Allied soldiers are Americans. And again, they're in England because they're ready to invade France, because France is occupied by the Germans. They have been since 1940. There is Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he's talking to some American paratroopers who are about to jump into Europe. Basically in the night or morning, however you want to configure it, I guess, of the invasion so that they can capture bridges and so forth before the Allies actually land on the beaches. If you look at the shoulder patch, guys, you'll see this is these are members of the 101st Airborne. So Hitler is not exactly just sitting back and waiting for this to happen inevitably. He had been busy building his so-called Atlantic Wall. But the reality is you can't build fortifications to stretch every square inch of the Atlantic coastline of Europe, and that would be impossible, right? And he has to he has to protect against potential invasions everywhere. The Allies could go to Norway or Denmark or the Netherlands or Belgium or France, or they can go anywhere they want. So where exactly should he put the majority of his forces to defend? Just a quick image here of the Germans here on their defenses on the beaches. Again, imagine the Allies having to attack through all this. Pretty big guns, I think we can say. Now, we are doing our best to keep Hitler guessing on exactly where we're going to go because we don't want his forces ready for our attack. And we do a pretty good job convincing him that we are going to go from England to Calais right here, because it's the shortest distance, of course, but also we had built this so-called dummy army or fake army right here under the command of General George Patton. And we had allowed a lot of German reconnaissance planes to fly over this area, and what they're seeing is this big army being built right there. But what they don't realize, it's a fake army. Right? You could, from a German observation plane, you can't tell the difference between an inflatable tank and a real one. Right? Pretty cool. We're not going to Calais. Where we're going is we're going to the beaches of Normandy. It's called Operation Overlord, and that's where we're heading. Specifically, these beaches right here. So this is June 6th, 1944. 150,000 Allied soldiers land on these 5 beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Utah and Omaha are American beaches. Gold, Juno, and Sword were all British and Canadian beaches. Again, Normandy is right here in northern France, and on June 6th, that's the day that we attack. So this is a good view of a lot of the defenses the Germans have ready for us. So again, imagine being an American or British or Canadian soldier landing here on this beach, and you have to fight your way through all these things with machine guns firing down on you. That's my cat in the background, in case you can't tell. All right. So the bloodiest of these beaches was Omaha Beach, guys. This was an American beach, and this is where the heaviest losses took place. This is what the beach looks like today, but imagine being an American soldier landing here back in the 1944, and the Germans are up here on these on the high ground shooting down at you. Very, very difficult to imagine. So the Allied invasion at Normandy, it's kind of touch and go for a while there, but eventually we establish a beachhead, and from that beachhead we're able to break out from that encirclement around Normandy and eventually were able to start pushing inland. And in August of 1944, August 25th specifically, Paris, the French capital, was liberated. Remember, Hitler had gone to Paris just that one time to celebrate his victory in 1944, but he's not celebrating anymore. That is behind him. Now, there were quite a few people who had collaborated with the Nazis in France, and by collaboration I mean they had worked with them because it certainly looked like in 1940-41 that Germany was going to win this war, and they were going to be there forever. And so people thought, well, hey, we better cooperate and work with the Germans. But now that the Germans are defeated, it's time to kind of call these people out and punish them for what's seen as basically treason, having helped the Germans against their own country. All right, well, let's talk about German resistance to the bitter end. This brings us to the largest battle American forces are going to fight in the European theater. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. Let's get some background on this. So by the winter of 1944, the Western Allies have been in France and Belgium for a couple months now. And they have pushed really far, really fast, and their supply lines are long, and they're running low on things. It's difficult to resupply the soldiers at the front lines. The soldiers themselves are exhausted from the very rapid march forward, and they kind of begin to slow down. And as we reach the border of Germany, our front line begins to kind of stabilize. Now that we're in the dead of winter, our attacks are going to slow down, and the war itself begins to almost take like a little bit of a break of sorts. Here's a good example of one of our weapons, an anti-tank gun designed to shoot German tanks if they were able to launch a counterattack, which they're about to. So Hitler decides, well, with the lull in the war in the West, this might be a great time to launch a surprise counterattack. So what he does is he orders kind of the best of what he's got left, and they launch a surprise counterattack in Belgium, right here. And their goal is to push all the way to Antwerp. Okay, by capturing Antwerp, they'll get their hands on needed supplies from the Allies. They'll be able to split the Americans from the British forces, and they think also they might score such a stunning victory that the Western Allies, that's the British and the Americans, will decide that this is an unwinnable war, and they'll sign a separate treaty with the Germans. And then Germany can turn their army around and face the Russians in the east, having only fight one front as opposed to two. This is an incredibly ambitious goal, and the Nazis are not going to cash in on any of those. They're not going to actually succeed in any of those goals. Now, it is true that we are caught completely off guard and surprised. We thought the German army was dead, and for them to launch this massive counterattack was shocking. And the Germans are able to capture quite a lot of land. And in fact, this is the front line before the battle. This is the front line during the battle. This area right here that the Germans are able to capture this is what gives the battle its name. This is called the bulge here, as the Germans push in to our lines. Now, one city in particular right here, Bastogne, famously refused to surrender. So American forces right there were told by the Germans, you're totally cut off, you better surrender. And the Allies said, nope, come and get us, basically. You can see some Americans captured in this surprise battle. And if he looks concerned, he should be, because sadly what happened is some of our prisoners of war were murdered by the Germans just because they didn't want to deal with them. They wouldn't, they were on an attack. They didn't have time or resources to really care for the American soldiers, so they simply murdered them. Now, what happens is the German attack is going to fail for a couple of reasons. Number one, the weather begins to clear up, which allows our Air Force to come in and just hit the Germans from the air very hard. Number two, the Germans they're running so low on things like fuel that many of their tanks are abandoned, not destroyed in battle, but just literally just run out of gas. And this, of course, our recovery from this shock, we're able to counterattack the counterattack and push the Germans further backward. And the Battle of the Bulge is really, in terms of strategy, a major misstep for Hitler, because he threw really the last best troops he had in the West in this attack, this desperate attack that was destined to fail. And he probably should have been, he would have been able to hold on longer if he'd used these soldiers in a defensive role, not in going on the attack. All right, let's now focus on the end game here. And the Nazis by 1945, they've got nothing but problems. Okay, the Allies have now pushed, they've pushed the Germans back, and now they've been pushed back so far that the Allies are on German soil by early 1945. So now the Germans are fighting on their own home ground. The Germans have been at war for 6 years almost, and their armies are exhausted. They're being pummeled by air assaults from American and British bombers coming from Britain and Italy, and they're just getting hit round the clock. And they're being squeezed between the Germans, or they're being squeezed between the Americans and the British in the west, and the Soviets in the east, and also the Americans coming up from the south as well. And as I said a moment ago, the German army is just basically, it's done, right? There's nothing left. And they're scraping the bottom of the barrel by putting old men and young boys into uniform. At the Yalta Conference, the Big Three decide to divide up Germany into 4 occupation zones. So even though the war is not even over yet, we're already planning for what's going to happen next. Stalin also agrees to declare war on Japan in the Pacific. But this idea of dividing Germany into 4 occupation zones is going to be a big topic when we get into our Cold War unit, which is going to be happening right after this unit. So you'll see this map again, where Germany is going to be divided up. All right, well, April 12th, 1945, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, dies suddenly from a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Basically, that means bleeding in the brain. Okay, brought on probably by a stroke. He had suffered from a long time from high blood pressure. He was a sickly man, honestly, and he finally passes. And Americans were obviously pretty emotional about this. This guy had been president since 1933, and for a lot of young Americans, that's about the only president they could really remember in their life. That same month, guys, by the end of that same month, the Soviets have surrounded the capital city, Berlin, and there's one last apocalyptic battle in Berlin where the Soviets are fighting against the last remnants of the Nazi army. House-to-house fighting, very brutal, very up front, and just very up close and personal type battles, very, very bloody. This is one of the last pictures ever taken of Hitler. This is actually on his birthday, April 20th, 1945. He has emerged from his bunker to congratulate and decorate some of his soldiers who are fighting in this final battle. And you can take a look at the soldiers and think, oh my gosh, they're kids. They should not be out shooting at Soviet tanks. 10 days later, Hitler takes his own life. Now, why does Hitler take his own life? It's primarily because he did not want to be captured and put on trial. He didn't want to wind up being strung up by his ankles like Mussolini. He just didn't want that to happen. So he kills himself along with his wife. Yes, he was married. We'll talk about that in just a second. And leaves orders for his body to be burned. So there's nothing left to be found. All right, so there's Hitler with his wife. And you're like, I didn't know Hitler was married. What? So the end of Hitler is a very bizarre tale. So Hitler marries his longtime companion, Eva Braun, basically the day before they both commit suicide. Again, it's the very, very end of the war. And they decide to take poison. Hitler was skeptical about the power of the poison, wasn't sure if it would actually work. And so he decided to test it out on his beloved German Shepherd, Blondie. So Blondie takes the poison and she dies. And Hitler was then assured that it will work. And so he and Eva Braun go into like a private room away from the rest of the people in the bunker. And they both take the poison. Hitler, however, was still worried the poison wouldn't work. So he decides to double up his chances and he shoots himself in the head in addition to taking the poison. So one way or the other, he would perish. There is the marriage certificate. Eva Braun, you can see her name there. Eva Hitler. And, yeah, that's why they'd even go through the formality. I honestly don't know, considering their marriage is going to last a day. There is the couch that they were sitting on, we think anyways, when they took their own lives. This is shortly after the war, kind of examining the bunker. With Hitler gone, there's no reason to keep the fighting up, and so on May 7th, 1945, Nazi Germany surrenders. The very next day was known as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, May 8th, 1945. This is it. But it's also a little bit bittersweet, and if you look right here on the subheading, you'll know why. War is just half over, right? So we're happy that the Nazis have surrendered, certainly, right? I mean, ecstatic. But we also know we have a war against Japan that's still ongoing, and some of our armed forces were going to be shipped over to the Pacific theater, and so you may have survived the European fight, but you might have to go fight and potentially die fighting against Japan in the Far East. All right, guys, that is it for our discussion of the victory in Europe. In our next video, we'll talk about the downfall of Japan, and then at the end of the unit, we'll finally take a look at the legacies of World War II, and that'll be it for the Second World War.